As chair of this first plenary, U.S. Transitions 2009, it is a pleasure to formally welcome our distinguished panelists. Gerhard Casper is the 9th president of Stanford University, having served from 1992 to 2000. The Peter and Helen Bing Professor of Undergraduate Education, a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and a professor of law and of political science by courtesy. Alan Garber is the Henry J. Kaiser Professor of Medicine, professor by courtesy of economics and of health research and policy. He's a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute, and he directs our Center for Health Policy and Primary Care and Outcomes Research. The center has just celebrated its 10th anniversary this year with their own September conference on better health, lower costs, can innovation save healthcare? Stephen Krasner is the Graham H. Stewart Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science at Stanford and a senior fellow both at the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution. As I noted, Steve served as Director of Policy Planning at the State Department from 2005 to 2007. As we look out at the landscape, there has rarely been a moment more fraught with danger and opportunity as new administrations in the U.S. and abroad face the interlocking challenges of terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and climate change, financial crisis and economic recession, soaring healthcare costs, hunger, pandemic disease, and energy security, a newly assertive Russia, and the grave implications of failed and failing states. Now, there is some good news out there, but we'll save it till later in the program. Gerhard, let me start with you, if I might. How grievous are the wounds that the rule of law has sustained over the last 7+ years, both conceptually and as a practical matter, and what can be done to heal those wounds?
Let me begin, by the way, with an observation. Life has made me a sociologist of higher education, and you are just behaving like any group of students. In the back of the room, all tables are filled. The empty spaces are up front. Welcome to Stanford University. Chip, I am afraid that even in light of the enthusiastic worldwide response to Barack Obama's election, the United States shall remain handicapped for the foreseeable future. Now, I was earlier this week in Budapest, and I have brought some show and tell about the response to Barack Obama, which I picked up on the flight to San Francisco. This is this week's Spiegel. I should probably get up. This is the very well-known German news magazine which Lufthansa distributed on the flight. And it is its cover story, and like every other news magazine in the world, its cover story is, of course, about Obama. But what the headline says is, Der Weltpräsident, the president of the world. And then what he will and what he wants to do and what he won't be able to do under that, and then, of course, this photo. I think had McCain been elected, the Spiegel would not have run a cover which would have said, Der Weltpräsident. And with this, of course, come lots of expectations that are actually quite dangerous. I think you do not want to be a president of the world. Indeed, a joke was circulating in Europe while I was there that the United States is the only country where the winner of a presidential election demands a recount because he doesn't want to get stuck with a job. You can understand that. Now, returning to trying to answer Chip's question, the fundamental problem, as I see it, is this. we have played the role of schoolmaster to the world throughout much of the post-World War II period. What has happened, especially in the last 8 years, is that much of our standing to give advice on how to do anything has been diminished. This is now true even in the area of market economics. Both the values we practice, as distinguished from those we preach, and our competence have been questioned so deeply by so many that the challenge to restore a measure of confidence, Chip, will be considerable. It will not happen overnight. Now, specifically, let me refer to our advocacy of the rule of law, due process, human rights. While our political openness and associational pluralism tend to bring forces into play that counteract authoritarian tendencies, we have just lived with the most extraordinary claims to unbound power since the days of Richard Nixon. This rejection of the rule of law, just like the photos of Abu Ghraib, will be present in the minds of many with whom we have to deal the world over. Just a few months ago, the outgoing president of the American Law Institute, by the way, a very restrained, I should like to say, organization. It's a kind of academy for lawyers. You have to get elected to be part of it. The outgoing president of the American Law Institute, Michael Traynor, a partner for 45 years at the venerable Bay Area law firm of Cooley Godwin, used the occasion of his farewell address to say the following, and I should like to quote from Traynor. I expect that many leaders and citizens, regardless of political affiliation, this was delivered in May, regardless of political affiliation, would agree that the rule of law is compromised and these values are subverted when a government tortures and cruelly and inhumanely degrades its captives, as at Guantanamo, Afghanistan, and Abu Ghraib. This outrageous behavior did not trickle up from unauthorized conduct by a few privates, corporals, and sergeants, but instead was authorized, defended, and encouraged at the highest levels of our government, justified by lawyers, including especially the Office of Legal Counsel at the Justice Department. When our government engages in an extraordinary rendition of captives to foreign countries for even more grotesque interrogation, remember the case of the Canadian-Syrian citizen whom we captured at JFK while he was on a stopover, and we then rendered him to Syria instead of to Canada, where he was living and where his family was. Though Syria was a country that we had just lambasted for its human rights violations. I continue with Traynor. When our president undermines an amendment against torture by a signing statement that, as commander-in-chief, he can ignore statutory mandates. When the government detains people indefinitely and seeks to deny them habeas corpus and judicial review, and so on, and so on, and so on. All of this, the memory of this, will not go away. And it will stay with many. And what will also stay with many is the fact that when these extraordinary claims to power were made by the executive, the Congress sat by weekly, WEA, we sat by weekly and did virtually nothing. Indeed, the Congress made its contributions to suspending the writ of habeas corpus, which the Supreme Court eventually, after many years, then struck down. So, In short, this all has happened, no, or let me add rather something. This all has happened against the background of a legal system, and I'm now speaking really as somebody who has been a law professor most of his life, that in any event is rather unruly and expensive, and it is said imprisons 1 of every 100 adults. The United States puts more people in prison than anybody else. And the best estimate at this point is that 1 in 100 adults sits in prison at any given moment in the United States. When in the future we advocate for the rule of law internationally, as we must do, of course, the humility presidential candidate George W. Bush promised in the 2000 election campaign will be a must, ironically because of the many of the policies of his administration.
Thank you, Gerhard. I think what we'll do is turn to each member of the panel to make opening remarks, and then we'll follow up. And I'm taking notes, and I encourage everyone else to do so, and I would hope that the panel would feel free to engage in cross-interrogation. Alan Garber. Alan, we face record budget deficits and an economy in recession. Given these realities, does it still make sense to talk about universal health care coverage? And by the way, why are American health care costs so high relative to other countries? Can we cut health care costs and improve outcomes? 3 simple questions.
Well, that should take 2 or 3 minutes. What am I going to do with my other 10 minutes? Normally, I have the doom and gloom spot in an FSI event because I talk about, well, one time I introduced a speaker who told us about the possibility of pandemic flu. And I guess you could say this might be the financial equivalent, but actually the picture is not quite as gloomy in the case of healthcare as Gerhard pointed to in the case of basically constitutional rights. Because although there's a lot of incredulity that foreigners express when they see how our health system performs, there's also a lot of admiration for some aspects of our healthcare system's performance. And I think that one of the hopeful things going forward, despite the crisis that we face in healthcare financing, is there is a lot of innovation in many areas of American medicine. And believe it or not, even though we are held to have the most inefficient health system in the world, there's much about our health system that other countries are trying to imitate and to adopt. Nobody wants to emulate our entire healthcare system, though. So I just want to first lay out a few basic facts of where we are now and talk a little bit about Chip's question about why we seem to have much higher health care costs than other countries. And then I want to speak about what President Obama and the Congress might do in the near term. I could try to predict long term, but I think all bets are off, especially until we have a better grasp of the overall economic situation. So you're all familiar with the fact that U.S. health expenditures are higher than in the rest of the world. In 2006, it was 15% of GDP devoted to health care in the U.S. The most expensive other countries by that measure were Canada and France and Germany at around 10 to 11%, and the UK at 8%, Japan also at about 8%. And I'm only going to be speaking about other wealthy nations because the issues in the rest of the nations of the world are considerably different. Now, there's a sort of triumphalist strain in some of the economics literature that looks at the U.S. healthcare system that points out that life expectancy has risen dramatically throughout the 20th century, and particularly in the period from 1970 to the most recent comparative statistics, which would be 2005 or so. There have been great gains in life expectancy at all ages. At the same time, though, our health expenditures on a per capita basis anyway have risen much more rapidly than in other countries and starting at higher levels. So now we're spending about twice as much per person as the average for OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and probably the most relevant comparison set of countries. And they too have experienced gains in life expectancy. There's not a completely consistent pattern, but overall, if anything, you would say they've had greater gains in life expectancy. If you look at softer outcomes like satisfaction with the healthcare system, affordability, and so on and so forth, we actually look considerably worse. In fact, some of you may have heard on the news this morning that yesterday the Commonwealth Fund released a report pointing out how much more common it was in the US for people to feel that they had to go without care because of affordability issues. Now, candidate Obama talked about expanding health insurance coverage, and of course, you might think of this as an issue for the Democratic primaries. It was a key point of difference between Obama and Hillary Clinton. Well, it wasn't really that much of a point of difference, but it was clearly an area where they had to show their bona fides by saying that they would get universal health care. And I thought it was really interesting that the issue did not die down in the general election campaign. Although other issues also became very important, obviously. And I believe that President-elect Obama is very serious about this, but there are going to be some issues he'll have to face if he wants to start with an insurance expansion to reach toward universal coverage. Obviously, there's an issue with the uninsured. The commercial health insurance is increasingly unaffordable. Actually, commercial insurance premiums did not go up as much this year as it has in recent years, but the out-of-pocket payments that people will have to bear have gone way up. We don't have systematic data on this, but anybody here who is a Stanford faculty or staff member knows that your co-payments, deductibles, the things you'll have to pay out of pocket will be going way up in 2009, and I believe that's representative of what's going on with employment-based health insurance. The issue that President Obama will have to face, though, that's likely to be more pressing than the problems of commercial health insurance is the issue of government-financed health insurance. So the government component of health care expenditures in the U.S. is about half the total. So in other words, we are spending via government funds about as much per capita as other wealthy nations are spending overall. And Medicare is a huge issue for the federal budget. And to this day, I think if you were to listen to Peter Orszag, the director of the Congressional Budget Office, or Ben Bernanke, they would continue to say that Medicare is the single greatest threat to the long-term viability of the federal budget or to the overall economy. We clearly have some more important short-term threats. And the reason Medicare is a problem is we have the cohort of the baby boomers who are going to move over from working ages to age 65 and older. And 2050 is a nice benchmark year to use to look at what might happen. And essentially, there's a gap between how much dedicated funding goes into Medicare and how much is actually spent. Medicare Part B, the physician services part, premiums only pay about 25% of the cost. The rest comes from general federal revenues. The Part D drug benefit is also heavily subsidized. And soon the Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, which I won't go into, but it's an accounting fiction. Even the fiction that we have money in there is going to disappear in about 10 years. And then we're going to have a big gap between projected expenditures and revenues. And by 2050, if you use the projections that the Office of the Actuary of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has published, and the CBO says those projections of expenditures are far too conservative, i.e. optimistic. If you use their expenditures, the unfunded liability for Medicare in 2050 is going to be 6% of GDP. And to put that in perspective, if you paid that out of income taxes, that would amount to roughly a doubling, in real terms, a doubling of the average personal income tax expenditure now on a per capita basis. So this is an issue. But guess what? We have a lot of company in this. The other wealthy nations of the world are also facing, at somewhat different rates and different severity, they're facing aging populations, Japan the most. Japan's percentage of the population over 65 between now and 2050 will nearly double to about 40% of the population, almost 40%. And most of the other wealthy nations, places like Australia, France, Germany, the UK, and so on, they'll be on the order of 24 to 30%, 65 and older. This has everybody scared because these are all government finance systems for the most part. So when President Obama takes office in January, he will be confronting the reality that there is a problem with Medicare, which is not an acute problem now. If he has a second term, it will actually be an acute problem by the end of the second term, though not as severe as what I've just described. And it's also very clear that the longer we wait until we do something about fixing the imbalance between Medicare revenues and expenditures, the more painful any solution will need to be. So that takes me to why we spend more, which I can say in a few simple words. The number one reason why we spend more than other countries is higher prices, but it's not that simple. I mean, there are some areas where we actually spend less than other countries. And there are various kinds of inefficiencies that we have, and I'll get to that in a moment. And we have a kind of strange, not truly market system, but a hybrid market and regulatory system that tends to work together to increase health expenditures. And other nations rarely have true market systems. And they generally do better at controlling cost growth. But if you ask them how they're doing, most of them would say that they're doing terribly at controlling health expenditure growth. And they only get some comfort by knowing the U.S. is doing worse. And I guess that's a distinction we might not want to maintain. So let me just turn to what might actually be done and how I think the president might approach this problem. First, a little bit of what I think is political reality, and this is what people in D.C. are saying. It's got to be true. President Obama is not likely to start with comprehensive health reform, simply because even before the financial crisis, the funds weren't there to do a major coverage expansion. What is much more likely to be passed is legislation expanding children's health insurance coverage. It's inexpensive. Virtually everybody agrees it's a good thing to do. And there are almost enough votes in Congress before to override President Bush's veto. That's relatively inexpensive. It will probably happen. But once they have to go through the CBO process of looking at budget projections and so on, it's going to be harder to say you'll do an insurance expansion that's more general. The advisors to Obama listed a number of things that could be done to cut costs, and it's a set of endeavors that I fully support. But the CBO and most independent analysts won't give them credit for the $200 billion a year in savings that they think will come about. And the things they want to do include wider adoption of healthcare IT, lowering administrative costs. Interestingly, the way they'll lower administrative costs is make basically edge out insurance brokers. This is something that I believe insurance brokers would no longer be selling insurance. So they have a big role, particularly in selling insurance to small employer markets and to individuals. That'll be interesting to see if that actually happens. And then they want to do a lot to rationalize the way that we pay for care. And for most of us, rationalizing the way we pay for care is the single most important thing we can do and the most difficult thing we can do. And to put it in very simple terms, the predominant mode of payment in the U.S. is for a physician or hospital to be reimbursed for every service provided, regardless of the quality. And it's a set of incentives that leads to higher degrees of utilization. And we tend to have greater utilization of expensive procedures than is true of other countries. That's not true across the board. Germany, in fact, tends to have a high rate of surgery. But no country combines high utilization with high prices the way that we do. And then the other thing is something that I'm very personally passionate about, which is figuring out whether what we do actually adds value. And one of the things that causes people in other countries to scratch their heads about the U.S. is whether a service is covered in the U.S. for insurance. If it's eligible for insurance coverage depends primarily on whether there's evidence that it's effective, and cost is not considered by private payers. And effectively, CMS, the agency that runs Medicare, is prohibited from considering costs. Not by legislation or direct regulation, but due to political reality, and that's something maybe we could talk about later. There are proposals to create an institute that will provide information about works and how valuable it is. And I'm going to contend that if you want to control not just the level of health expenditures, but the rate of growth, this is going to be the foundation of any effort going forward. We actually know a lot about what might work. Some of the practices would be adopted from other countries, but if we're allowed to let experiments in how we pay for care flourish in the US, everybody else will be learning from us. So it's a big challenge. I think this is a tremendous opportunity, and I have to tell you that I think President Obama will have an unprecedented level of sophistication about these issues, so I'm very hopeful.
Thank you, Alan. Steve, the new president inherits 2 wars, one in Iraq, which he says he'll end in 16 months, and another in Afghanistan, which he argues should be the real front in the fight against terrorism. In neighboring Pakistan, which of course is a nuclear weapon state, both political and economic conditions are continuing to deteriorate, and the writ of the government appears to be limited to the country's largest cities. Iran, in the meantime, seems hell-bent on becoming a nuclear power in its own right, and has so far proved impervious to either the carrot or the stick, although in fairness I would underscore they've seen more of the stick than the carrot. Where does the new president start? What should be our immediate priorities, and what realistically can we expect to get done?
Thanks. I'm trying to decide whether, looking across the panel, kind of your level of pessimism is just going to increase from one to the next, or whether I'm actually going to be a little more upbeat than either Gerhard or Alan. Let me say, a few things in general, because I think the way in which Gerhard described the situation is fundamentally inaccurate in a number of ways, and then say something about where we are in a number of major issues if we look at foreign policy, thinking about great power relations, global initiatives, the Middle East, and then reflecting on the situation in Afghanistan and Iraq. Let me begin with this issue of standing. So if you think about standing in 2 ways, one is competence, how people perceive American competence, and the other is the level of anti-Americanism. I think it's evident that people perceive our competence as being less than they have in the past, and levels of anti-Americanism have increased dramatically since 2002. The question is, does this matter? If you look at relations with other countries, it will not matter if our interests are convergent with those of other countries. If we have the same objectives and we believe we should pursue those objectives in the same way, whether they think we're competent or not is not going to matter in terms of what they do. Likewise, if our interests are divergent with other countries, how they perceive our competence is not going to matter. It only matters in situations where other countries are ambiguous or ambivalent in terms of their interests and the way in which they agree with or disagree with the United States. And while I think that exists in some areas, I would say it exists in relatively few areas. Let me begin by saying a few things about great power relations. I think great power relations will not change one whit under President Obama. I think if you look at our relations with Europe, it's still Mars and Venus, and this issue is not going to go away. Of the 26 members of NATO, only 6 meet the NATO requirement that countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And the trend is going down, not up. If you look at Europe's interest in terms of defense commitments, it's very hard to see any reason why they would stop free riding on the United States. If you're a rational European leader, why would you want to send more troops to X, Y, or Z country? If you look at European attitudes towards war, they're fundamentally different from those of the United States. Italy, is able to keep a few troops overseas. if anybody gets killed, I mean, it's a tremendous national tragedy. And it hinges on a very weak coalition government, which has always been the case in Italy. But this is true for other countries as well. If you ask, and this is the one, I mean, major concrete problem in front of us, will European caveats on the use of troops in Afghanistan, that is, especially for a number of countries, Germany and many others, limiting the use of their troops in the South, will that change? I will bet now, 2-to-1 odds, Gerhard, $100. No, they won't. So it's not going to, if you look, I think, at these issues, it's not clear. I mean, if we're looking at Western Europe, our major allies, that we're going to see changes, including in areas like Afghanistan, where we do agree on this being a significant problem. Eastern Europe is still going to be nervous about Russia, and Western Europe is still going to try to engage Russia. So if you look at our relations with Europe, I do not think they'll change under the new president. India, the Bush administration made a major commitment to engage with India, signed this nuclear deal with the Indians. I think American and U.S. and Indian relations will continue to grow closer. I think that's driven by both common economic interests for at least a major part of the Indian elite and for the United States, and anxiety about China's growing power. If you look at our relations with China, Bob Zoellick, when he was Deputy Secretary of State, made a speech in New York in which he said China should be a responsible stakeholder. I do not see this administration, the new Obama administration, moving away from that. We're not going to move towards a policy of containment vis-a-vis China. Japan is going to continue to rely on American leadership, and if you look at East Asia in general, China, Japan, and South Korea will continue to want American engagement, because if the United States withdraws from East Asia, the situation would become much more uncertain for all of the major powers in the area. All right, so I don't think our great power relations are going to change. What about global initiatives? The Bush administration was beaten up badly for withdrawing from the ICC and the Kyoto Climate Protocol at the beginning of the administration. Will the United States join the ICC, the International Criminal Court? Not an ice cube's chance in hell. Will we sign anything like a Kyoto Protocol, a Kyoto-like protocol on climate warming? No. Now, I mean, if the issue in climate warming has to do essentially with what India and China do, and with the introduction of new technology, and I think that's something where the United States and other countries will be more or less on the same page. Something that Obama will do, he will close Guantanamo and close it quickly. It's something that's under American control. It's under the control of the president. The cost-benefit calculation with regard to Guantanamo will demand that it closes. All right, let me say a few things quickly about the Middle East and then turn to Iraq and Afghanistan. Gulf states and Saudi Arabia rely on an American security umbrella that's not going to change. They're not going to run away from us, and they're not going to embrace us. They're going to take exactly the stance that they've taken over the last decade. Iran. Iran is building a nuclear bomb. Make no mistake about it. What are our options? First best option, internal regime change in Iran. There is a lot of internal dissent and unhappiness in Iran. There is no organized resistance to the regime. We could have no confidence or expectation that there will be internal regime change. Second best outcome, a successful deal or negotiation. I think this is extremely unlikely. Iran is seeking a major role, a major regional role. Iran is fearful of the United States. The regime is legitimated by antagonism to the West. A nuclear weapon is consistent with the regime's internal and external interests. Why would they give it up through a process of negotiation? All right, what are the third and fourth best options? And you can decide which you think is third best and which you think is fourth best. Third best is live with a nuclear Iran. Dangerous, would encourage proliferation in the region, not clear that the Iranian government could control its nuclear weapons. The other third or fourth best option is attack Iran's nuclear facilities, which might be successful, and I actually don't know what our military capability is, but would certainly support increased domestic support for the Iranian regime. So I think that third or fourth best options are live with a nuclear Iran or attack Iran. That's no change from where we are now, but that's where we're going to be, and neither of those is very attractive. Palestine, you know, maybe this is an area where we could be more hopeful for this reason. It's been clear what the outlines of a settlement have to be. There has to be a two-state solution. It has to be based on the 1967 borders, plus or minus a couple of percent. There has to be some kind of shared or divided authority over Jerusalem. There will not be a right of return for Palestinians, and there's going to be lots of international aid. That's clearly been on the table since the end of the Clinton administration. The issue is, so why no deal? And the answer is because the internal incentives within both Palestine and Israel don't drive them to a deal. It's possible that this could change, although there's still Hamas. It's still not clear how much authority the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank will have. Any Israeli government is going to be weak. The question is, would Obama matter in this regard? Okay, maybe, although it's not so easy to say exactly how. It's not transparent exactly how. His middle name being Hussein is actually not going to give the Palestinians that much more confidence. All right, finally, Iraq and Afghanistan. I think Obama is going to be very cautious about withdrawing from Iraq, and this is to say he'll be deliberate and cautious. And the problem for Obama is this: if he withdraws and Iraq crumbles, it's going to crumble on his watch and he'll be blamed for it. And he will not want that to happen. That will be a blot on his presidency. And I think if you look at the Iraqi leadership, well, on the one hand, yes, they have to say they want the Americans out. They themselves will also be worried about Iran and worried about internal disorder. So I think the issue will be not a disappearance of American troops from Iraq, but how many troops will still be there and where they will be. That is, whether they will be inside the country or outside the country. But don't expect some dramatic end to American engagement in 16 months. That will not happen. Afghanistan, thank you for asking me this question, Chip, since I have no answer to it. All right, we're not going to leave because our national security is at stake. The Europeans are not going to step up to the plate for the reasons I alluded to before. There is no short or medium-term solution because Pakistan is not going to be able to govern the federally administrated tribal areas and other areas along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. So I think what we'll move to, and you'll already see Petraeus alluding to this, is something like an effort to stabilize Afghanistan domestically by moving away from a commitment to a strong national government, making regional deals within the country, cutting deals with the Taliban if we can, and even with local warlords. That's going to mean stepping away from our rhetoric about democratization in Afghanistan and making Afghanistan a well-functioning, more modern state, but it may create a degree of stability which would serve our security interests as best we can. There certainly is no perfect solution. Bottom line, the United States is going to remain the global hegemon for the foreseeable future, and our interests haven't changed with the new administration. So don't expect to see some kind of dramatic and significant alteration in our foreign policy with the Obama administration.
Thank you, Steve, but next time you do this, I would urge you actually to speak your mind.
Yeah.
Don't hold back.
Let's be fair, guys. The big issue here is boredom and banality. Even at this hour in the morning.
That's right.
So we got to try a little.
Absolutely. I have questions for each of you, but I know Gerhard in particular wanted the opportunity to respond to Steve.
Steve, I agree with quite a lot of what you said, except, of course, your first sentence, that I was fundamentally inaccurate. I like to quote Justice Brennan in New York Times against Sullivan about the nature of public debate. It should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And in that spirit, you may say anything, including something as obviously false as saying I was inaccurate. But let me actually, I do agree with a lot of what you said after you said, well, not much will change if the interests of the great powers coincide. Of course, nothing will change. And everything will be smooth where everybody has the same interests. How many areas of that kind exist may be another question. But I want to come back to actually your finishing line. You said we will remain the global hegemon. And of course, that is actually something you could also hear across the world last week after the election. And in a way, the Spiegel cover I brought demonstrates that point. But a hegemon, in order to be influential, has to have I think, three different elements. The hegemon has to have strong military power. Yeah, and everybody says we have more soldiers and so on. By the way, our military is very poorly equipped, as every expert will tell you, in particular Secretary Perry. But we have more military might. But the question is, we don't even have enough military might to conduct two rather small-scale wars at the same time, as we are ran into one difficulty after another. After all, we are now 6 years into Iraq and are still seeing lots of problems. I am just not impressed by our military capacity as a hegemon. Now, a hegemon can also be a hegemon because the hegemon has more money than anybody else. Well, we certainly don't. I mean, in many areas, as Alan pointed out, others don't have more resources either and will face all these problems of aging populations and what have you. But let me assure you, we have no money for anything. We have terrible schools, we have an infrastructure that is crumbling, and I don't think we will be able to throw a lot of money around to maintain our position as hegemon. And how can we persuade others to do things the way we would like them to happen? Well, only through discussion, through debate. And there, our competence matters tremendously. I mean, there will be a large number of environmental issues. There will not, of course, not the least of the issues is the global economy and what to do about it and what to do to, we will never make it impossible for something like this to never to occur again. But what can we do to develop a system worldwide that will somewhat cabin the instincts that led to the present crisis? When we sit at those tables negotiating with everybody else and needing to persuade others to do what we would like them to do, we need to have standing. And that is our main resource. That is our main resource to deal with things in the world, to persuade others that we are right. And we have, as I said, we can do that again, but we have a long way to go to recreate confidence.
Let me ask a follow-on that's fairly specific and is also one of the few points, I think, where Steve and Gerhard can probably, not few points, that's unfair, but one of the most important points around which I suspect there is convergence. And that is either the political necessity or the moral necessity, or both, to close Guantanamo in the shortest possible time frame. As a practical matter, then, what do you do with those who are currently incarcerated who are adjudged to pose a continuing threat, as opposed to those who may have been wrongly incarcerated or whose transgressions are not of such magnitude that we have to fear what happens when they are released?
Is this a question for Steve or both of us?
You, either of you.
Steve, you want to go first? Or? No.
Well, no, you know more. You're a lawyer.
Well,
You know more about
let me just say that actually, I think the Guantanamo problem or rather the enemy combatants problem that was presented was more complex than many are willing to admit. And there was a point when I was by no means completely out of sympathy with the administration's, first of all, problem, and secondly, trying to find new ways of handling it. And I think I can give you the best answer by saying how I would have handled Guantanamo, or how I would have handled the problem of these 800 or so enemy combatants that we initially held at the time. Now, first question, why a special label? Why were they not just prisoners of war? And I think the Bush administration made a very rational and reasonable argument that prisoners of war status and the overall protection coming with the Geneva Conventions is due to the fact that countries, sovereign countries, have negotiated these treaties and they stand behind to enforce them, to live by them, and so on. In the case of Al-Qaeda, you have an enemy that has not signed any treaties whatsoever, that is not part of the international state system, and so to the extent to which the captives were Al-Qaeda captives, as distinguished, by the way, from Taliban captives, we treated in the end Al-Qaeda and Taliban just the same way, though the Taliban had been Afghanistan, and I would have thought of all Taliban prisoners as prisoners of war. But that's a minor issue. So I would have done, first of all, I would have tried not to capture quite as many as they did. They created a problem for themselves by accepting these people who were sold to them essentially for money from the battlefields of Afghanistan. But secondly, I would have immediately given review to every case repeatedly on the best evidence I had, and review before panels that I would have made as close to ordinary judicial panels as I possibly could have done, and then send as many of them home as quickly as possible. We are now, suddenly, we are down to 250 people in Guantanamo. Well, where are all the others? The others have eventually, after lots and lots of delays, etc., have eventually been sent home. And mind you, we weren't even sending people home who were British citizens or Australian citizens. We took a very adamant position. And of course, we also, at the beginning of Guantanamo, used interrogation methods, that's a whole different question, that I certainly would have not have used. I would have announced at the very beginning, look, there are many aspects of the Geneva Conventions that are awkward. Like under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners actually have a right to organize. Well, you clearly didn't want that. So I would have said, look, let us say, these provisions of the Geneva Conventions we cannot live with for these enemy combatants. But the following we will abide. And those, of course, involved in particular the humane treatment of prisoners. And we initially did not do that. I would have tried to reduce the number of prisoners we held as quickly as possible to a small number of truly dangerous. If we had made that point to the world very clearly and very loudly, we would not have nearly turned Guantanamo into the symbol that we turned Guantanamo into. We would have found a lot of understanding, because the basic problem is, of course, there. If we are presently holding 30 or so very dangerous Al-Qaeda people, we cannot and do not want to let them loose again. Now, if you had reduced that number to 30 and if you had evidence on them, I would still have used the criminal law process on as many as possible. But, and now I come to the bottom line, and it is a very difficult position. I think there eventually may be a very small number of people who, when we have repatriated them to the continent, we will hold in facilities without trying them and without releasing them for the foreseeable future. And I am not convinced, as long as we give them steady review of their cases, that that is an outcome we cannot live with.
Steve.
Yeah, just let me add, something to what Gerhard said. I mean, the fundamental problem here is that we have two sets of existing laws. One, the laws of war, and second, conventional criminal law, which actually don't work in the situation that we're in now. So if you look at this last set of prisoners that Gerhard is talking about, we have no legal structure for dealing with them. And I think one thing you will see in the new administration is some effort to develop a legal regime which is capable of dealing with the set of issues associated with terrorism. Can I say one? I'm going to say one more thing about standing. You know, I think the issue is this: if you're looking about standing, our ability to influence other people to get what we want in terms of negotiation, I think what we have to say is it really depends on at least three things. I mean, one is their view of our competence, which is clearly lower than it has been in the past. The second is the effectiveness of the arguments that we offer. That is part of our ability to be persuasive, does depend on the positions that we're taking. And finally, and I think actually most critically, it depends on the resources and institutional structure which other states have. And here is why I think challenges to the United States may be more modest than we think. If the Europeans were willing to increase their defense expenditures to 3% and had lift capabilities so they could operate at a global level, the world would be very different than the world we're in now. There is no way in which the Europeans are going to do that, I think. So this failure to actually institutionalize all capabilities which would give other countries more bargaining power, that's something which I do not see happening as dramatically as some might fear.
Let me shift the focus back to healthcare for a moment. I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to Alan, and then I want to come back to an issue with Steve Krasner. Alan, two questions, not necessarily related. One reflective of my ignorance. The other one, I think, just an attempt to figure out how bad the problem's going to get. The one that reflects my own ignorance is, to what extent is the problem associated with the containment of healthcare costs in the United States structurally overdetermined, as opposed to a consequence of conscious political choices? Now, I know that everything's structural and everything's political, but I'm trying to get some sense out of how much control over this do we actually have? That's the first question. The second one is, how much worse does this problem become for us and for the rest of the developed world if, instead of looking like the dot-com bust of 2000, 2001, this looks to be a much deeper economic downturn comparable to what we experienced in the mid to late 1970s? Does it just blow us completely out of the water?
Chip, those are great questions. I have to admit I'm not quite sure how to answer the first, how much the excessive expenditure is structurally overdetermined. And if you take the political economy perspective on that question and you ask who wins, who loses, and is there really a constituency to get a grasp on costs, this actually relates to your second point because that shifts the whole balance. The issue here, of course, is very much analogous to the debate over the bailout of the auto industry. If you read Tom Friedman's column yesterday, he talked about how it was basically a conspiracy between, that wasn't his term, but between the automakers and the politicians from Michigan. And in healthcare, you have this fairly toxic mix of regulation, political influence, and so on, which tends to lead to very powerful interest groups and a very weak voice for the common good. You could debate whether it's good or it's bad, but I have to just tell you an anecdote. There are some people in the room who are old enough to remember this, but in the 1960s, Medicare, I guess it was late 60s, Medicare started to pay for the care of everyone who needed hemodialysis, who had kidney failure. And this happened after a rather heartbreaking article, I think, in Life magazine, where they talked about the God Committee that decided who in Seattle could get hemodialysis. They were certainly going to die without it once they had kidney failure. So the congressional hearing, and I think this was in front of the Ways and Means Committee when Wilbur Mills was the chairman, they wheeled in a guy who was the father of 2 young kids, and a fairly young guy, and did his dialysis session while he was testifying in front of the Ways and Means Committee. And, you know, I think in the end it was probably the right thing to do to cover this, but I have to tell you that numbers, projections of expenditures, ideas about fairness, et cetera, they all fly out the window when you have a compelling situation, and you can basically control the dialogue that way. And I've had a lot of involvement in Medicare coverage decision-making where these meetings are very public. And there's a battle between basically appealing to the press and the public and trying to appeal to data, science, and so on. And I think both have roles, but the balance of power is very much away from the science. And this is one reason why we end up with very different decisions than other countries. And I'm sorry if I sound a little bit cynical about this, but it comes from having spent maybe a little too much time in Baltimore, where CMS is. But there's the very important point that Chip is raising with his question about how does the financial crisis affect things is that the opportunity to change comes from crisis. In fact, many people have received credit for something Paul Romer, a Stanford economist, said, which is crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And this is an area where you could get real change when enough people see that, that the alternative of just trying to maintain the status quo is far more dangerous to our long-term health than pursuing aggressive change. And you think about the birth of the National Health Service in England, that occurred during a period of tremendous crisis. And I'm not saying that we'll have that kind of change, but a lot of things are going to be on the table when people realize that we're in an untenable position, maybe not for today, but for the next 10 years. So I actually think the financial crisis is going to push us in the direction of moving first toward cost-containing type reforms. And those of us who feel that coverage is really important, expansion coverage is important, could view this as a negative development, but I don't. Because I think that this had to happen before you could have a serious discussion about coverage expansion. So I see this as a tremendous opportunity. It's not that it's going to be painless, but it's going to change the political dialogue about healthcare reform.
Thank you, Alan. Steve, I was struck in your recitation of issues, starting with the great power relationships. Unless I fell asleep in the middle of it, which I don't think I did, you didn't say anything about Russia. If you're the incoming national security advisor and it comes time to brief the president-elect on Russia, what do you say to him?
I just want to say it was on my notes. And the second thing I want to say is you should be asking yourself that question. Since you know much more about it than I do. So I'll give you my answer, Chip, and then you can say why I'm wrong. You know, I think if you look at Russia now, it's a state where there is a kind of melding of national interest, energy policy, and the personal pecuniary interests of the leaders of the state. It's a kind of petrostate that runs better than some other petrostates. I think Russia's ability to throw its weight around will depend, I would say, completely on the price of oil, which now at $55 a barrel, if it stays down, is going to make Russia much less troublesome than it has been over the last couple of years. So I would say, actually, don't worry about Russia too much, as long as the economic downturn continues. Now, when that reverses, then you may begin worrying about it again.
Okay, let's ratchet this up a little bit. Notwithstanding the fact that you've got less money or fewer resources to play with than you have in the past, if you're in the Kremlin, you have to be both pleased and slightly aghast at the consequences of your actions in Georgia. I'm less worried about how the Kremlin leadership sizes this up immediately than I am about how other leaderships in the former Soviet space draw certain calculations. So how does Russia look if you're in Kyiv, or if you're in Warsaw, or if you're in Tallinn, and what is the U.S. responsibility in order to provide some strategic reassurance? Some are NATO member states. Some would like to get in, some are not ready to be admitted, in my judgment. Some probably should never even be talked about as possible members. So what do you say to the incoming president?
Let me expand it a little bit to Central Asia.
Yeah, please.
You know, I think one rational reason for what the Russians did in Georgia was to signal to Central Asia that don't think that you can explore seriously this idea of getting your oil out without going through Russia. You built one pipeline, the BTC pipeline, which goes from Azerbaijan to Georgia to Turkey. Don't think you're going to get away with another one. And technically, this is very feasible. The distance between the Azeri oil fields in the Caspian Sea and the oil fields of some of the other oil-producing states in the region is something like 40 kilometers. So it wouldn't be hard to hook these things up. They haven't been hooked up. The United States has actually pressed hard for this over the years. The Europeans have been more lukewarm. I do not think it will happen. And I think the Georgia invasion is a very clear signal to these countries that they ought to be very cautious. All right, my view about, and this again I want to turn to you, and if you tell me I'm wrong, actually I will accede immediately. I think thinking about Tallinn and Warsaw is one thing. You know, thinking about Kiev is another. I think for the countries that are in NATO and in the European Union now, we've made a commitment to them from which we cannot withdraw. I think if you're looking at Ukraine or Georgia, in my view, we ought to be cautious here. I think there's little gain for us. I know that, you know, one position is, well, we can't give the Russians a veto over NATO membership for these countries. Maybe we don't want to give them a veto, but I would say here we ought to think at least a bit about their sensibilities, even though I'm not sure that we can influence them very much. So I would be quite cautious about moving forward with Ukraine and Georgia. I don't see what we get out of it.
For once, I totally agree with you, and now I'm beginning to distrust myself. But I really think we should delay any discussion about Ukraine and Georgia becoming members of NATO ad infinitum. We should not stop the discussion. And I think saying this gives the Russians a veto is a highly legalistic way of thinking about it and not one that reflects the politics of the region. The real question we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready to defend Ukraine, or for that matter, Georgia, if Russia, once stronger again with the oil price higher, engages in another power play? And I cannot see that. And if we are not prepared to defend Ukraine or Georgia, we should not say we will, which is what we do when we make them members of NATO.
Alan, I don't want to leave Russia yet, and it's not just because it's the area of the world to which I have devoted most of my intellectual energies over the years. It's because of this extraordinary disconnect between certain aspects of Russia and its ostensible power and some incredibly serious domestic, social, economic, and health issues. And I know that you're not an infectious disease specialist, and I know Doug Owens is out there somewhere. I just saw him, who has been working this issue. But could you talk a little bit about the implications going forward, not only and not even primarily for the U.S., but for the way we think about global health as a consequence of more and more pathogens emerging for which we do not appear to be equipped scientifically, and you know what that, how that will likely change our conception of national power, with Russia as the poster child because of these extraordinary rates of drug-resistant TB and HIV/AIDS.
Well, Chip, I think, notwithstanding your interest in Russia, it's a very broad problem. And first of all, I want to put in a plug for our next concurrent session, where Doug Owens and Eran Ben David will be speaking about some of these same issues, primarily from the African perspective. But if you ask them questions about Russia, where they've worked, they can also tell you a lot about that. So if you want to hear it from the experts, show up there. But one of the biggest issues is the drug-resistant TB is not the one that probably keeps us up the most at night, although many of you probably heard about the case that came to Stanford Hospital of somebody who had multi-drug resistant TB and exposed a lot of people on an airplane and elsewhere after landing when she wasn't supposed to travel. But there's a broader issue of diseases crossing national boundaries. Most of the attention is focused on East Asia, where the flu, a new strain of flu, if we get pandemic flu, is most likely to originate. Our flu vaccines are actually composed of strains of flu that were found the year before, typically, in East Asia. They tend to originate there and then spread. And one of the critical challenges will be how to detect early so that you can respond, because obviously the most rapid response to a known outbreak of disease is not very effective if it's too late in the outbreak that you're actually able to detect it. And this will require tremendous international cooperation. And the issue in Russia has a lot to do with IV drug users and so on. And Doug has done a lot of work on this topic and about the fact that the Russian policy toward this is not to screen and aggressively treat in that population, even though that would have the greatest payoff in terms of preventing the toll of the disease, including transmission of the disease. But as a security issue, if you look at it like another outbreak of the 1918 flu pandemic, and you're looking at on the order of 100 million or more deaths worldwide, it's quite clear that this eclipses most man-made disasters in the potential toll. And so the key is going to be a lot of trust, because this really requires having surveillance at distant outposts, particularly in rural China, and having effective mechanisms to communicate within the nation and then internationally, and using international resources to characterize the pathogen, the bug that would be causing the outbreak. And we've had a lot of experience, for example, in Indonesia, where it's very difficult to secure cooperation to be able to do the necessary laboratory studies. So I think Chip's making a very salient point. This is an area where American credibility and trust in both American motives and competence is going to be key to success, because it is still the case that a great deal of the scientific expertise resides in the U.S. And failure for us to be an important part of that discussion is going to be a big failure worldwide.
Thank you, Alan. Listening to the conversation this morning, I am very struck by the fact that almost everything that has been said about what can be done and what should be done ultimately rests on a set of judgments about the capacity of this country to exercise effective leadership. I think everyone in this room understands that all of the issues we've talked about here this morning are deeply interconnected, that in fact it's impossible to conceptualize a positive outcome in the restoration of the rule of law, or how to deal effectively with outbreaks of deadly infectious disease, or how to think about managing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and trying to preserve stability in Pakistan, how any of those issues can be dealt with in isolation from the other issues. There have been moments in time in American history, most notably the celebrated period between the end of World War II and the outbreak of the Korean War in June of 1950, that at least in retrospect draws from most Americans, but also many, many non-Americans, great praise for the way in which leadership was exercised in a way that set in place the great post-war order, which had served us so well for so long. So as we conclude this initial plenary, I'd like each of you to take a couple of moments and respond to the question, do we have it in us? Can we exercise the type of leadership that I think is going to be required, that would have been required whether Barack Obama were to prove triumphant or John McCain. We know the outcome, but the challenges haven't changed. So do we have it in us? And I'd like to start where we started earlier this morning, and that's with Gerhard, and then Alan, and then Steve.
Oh, I have no question that we have it in us, as you say. And let me take off for one, on something that Alan had just said when he talked about infectious diseases and the fact that most of the know-how about how to deal with them is still in the United States, the scientific know-how. And that gets me, of course, to another area where we still have very much the edge of competence, and that is in higher education. American higher education absolutely retains the edge. Now, in some areas, it may now be in public universities. It may now become more dangerous as the states are retreating from their strong support in the past. But on the whole, we have no reason to assume that our universities, even as we all will engage in belt tightening because of the economic crisis and because endowments have lost value and so on, we will definitely remain in a leadership position. And we can regain leadership positions in the areas where we may have lost them simply by doing what I think we need to do, and that is to make sure that we approach every table at which we negotiate, every international problem that has to be solved with a great sense of people who are competent, who are not cliche-driven, who have done their homework before they sit at the table about possible solutions and about the other people at the table. And I think we have a pretty good chance that we will actually pull that off as we change, for one reason simply because we change personnel. I am a strong believer in change, never mind whether somebody has done it very well or not. We need fresh perspectives, and we will have lots of fresh perspectives, and we will have, I think, at least for a while, more input from abroad and a greater willingness to listen. Certainly that Obama has made that point over and over again in the election campaign.
Thank you, Gerhard. Alan?
I too am very optimistic in the domain of health anyway, that we will not just muddle through, but will succeed. And I think the challenge before us is not really, will we be able to get the Medicare budget under control? That's partly a question of what you mean by control, and it's partly a question of how painful it will be to get there. But the real issue is how quickly and how effectively do we move to a much better performing healthcare system with good access to care for all Americans. It's easy to forget that we came very close in the past, including most recently during the Clinton administration, to actually passing major health reform legislation. There were some bad decisions made, but we were very, very close. And I think that things are lined up now politically, so there's another shot if, as I said before, we manage to get costs under control. But the one point I really want to make, to pick up on what Gerhard said, is that we have very, very competent healthcare providers. We have our biotechnology, pharma industry, are really and device industry are the envy of the world. The problem is not a lack of competence, and in a way it's not a lack of will. The problem is that the incentives under the current system actually lead to excessive expenditures. And I am very optimistic that if we can just get the expenditures right, and I don't mean perfect, just make them, get the incentives aligned in a way that pushes us toward more efficient care, we will get that. And I just have no doubt that the players we have in the U.S. are as good or better than the players anywhere else in the world when it comes to health care. So we can very well succeed. And in this case, the fact that the presidential candidates both made health care something of a priority, and in Obama's case, it's not something of a priority, it was one of the top priorities, leads me to believe that he will spend a fair bit of political capital to make things happen. So that makes me all the more optimistic.
Thank you, Alan. Steve?
I would say we have a better chance than anyone else, but that doesn't mean we'll be successful. And I just want to allude to two issues. One is an issue that Gerhard raised in his initial discussion, not an international issue. That is the percentage of people in the United States in prison. In all of the debates, I can only remember one candidate raising this issue, and that was Mike Gravel, who said we ought to reform our drug laws. And this is a disgrace and a scandal, and it's nowhere on the table as far as I can see in the United States politically, and I'm not sure how it's going to get put on the table. Let me say something on the international side about why we have a better chance than anyone else, but we might not succeed. I think our biggest challenge in foreign policy, the one which is the most difficult to deal with, is thinking about how we deal with failed and badly governed states. I mean, both because of our own national security and because of the situation in people in those countries. This has been a very daunting issue for the United States. Carlos Pascual, who's going to speak this afternoon, was the first coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization in the State Department, which was an effort to address this issue. Carlos can, I think, speak at length about how difficult it was to actually get reorganization in the U.S. government. If you look at current American expenditures, we spend $800 billion on defense and $40 billion on our civilian capacity internationally. The ratio is 20 to 1. If you talk to people about counterinsurgency, they should say the civilian component should be 80% and the military component 20%, exactly the opposite of what we have now. If you ask how we might change this, every possible organizational option is fraught with difficulty. We could try to increase the capacity of the State Department, but the State Department hasn't been an operational agency. We could make USAID a cabinet-level agency, but it's unclear then whether or not it would actually take effective political direction. We could move stuff into DOD, even more stuff into DOD, because they have money and they're very good operationally, but it's not clear that they have the sensitivity or long-term staying power to meet the political goals. So I think if you look at this question of poorly governed and failed states and ask what it would take to actually address this effectively, it will require major reform within the U.S. government. It's major reform which will not have any political payoff for a new president, and regardless of what you do, it's not clear that it will make things better. So I think that's a huge and I think quite daunting challenge.
I think you can see why, left to my own personal devices, I would probably urge everyone to take a short break and then come back so that we could keep this conversation going. I think it's always a good thing when we have less time than we have good ideas, and I think part of the reason why I've enjoyed this opening session so much and why I very much meant what I said, that it's my great good fortune to serve as the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute, is because of the qualities of mind, obviously, but also the capacity of these first-class minds to engage creatively and substantially with real-world issues and to understand the connections and interconnections that make each of the challenges we confront notionally separate, in fact, compounded and conflated. I hope you have some sense, I hope you will leave this session this morning with some sense for what any incoming administration confronts when it seeks to put together a foreign defense and security policy team. And I would hope that as a consequence of that, we will also grant the new administration, and again, I'm not talking about one outcome or the other, but as Barack Obama has said, we have one president at a time, and on January 20th at 12:01 we'll have a new one. Grant them a bit of a grace period as they seek to grapple with these enormously complex problems. But with that, please join me in thanking my colleagues, Stanford's greats, Gerhard Casper, Alan Garber, and Steve Krasner.